Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share with you. You should know that a bit of history where we got to this place. William and I had a class last year, and I had actually shared that I have never ever preached on the book of Ecclesiastes ever in my life. And one of the reasons is I never really spent enough time on the 12 chapters. And then William gave me a challenge. And so here we are. Right? In these next 2 weeks, we will deal with the book of Ecclesiastes, a little bit of what we call uh, of study, but more so from a higher level rather than a detailed level, to get a better handle of the entire book. There is no way that we can actually do all 12 chapters in detail. But in these 2 weeks, I hope to give us a better sense of what Ecclesiastes presents to us and how does it reflect on the relevance of our lives today. And so let's begin. Ecclesiastes is comprised of 12 chapters in our Bibles, and we have loved many of the verses, and we've made songs out of it. As we go through the book of Ecclesiastes, it should ring well in some of our old songs and old hymns, actually. But more importantly, I think there are some very key messages that Ecclesiastes brings to us that we generally don't think much of. So allow me to share with you some of the thoughts. Number one, as we begin, who is this so-called preacher, right? And by preacher, you see verse 1, and in verse 1, you could see the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. One of the challenges that we have is that our English translations sometimes do not quite uh, completely reflect the Hebrew. And as such, when you read some of the commentaries, you find that they prefer to use the Hebrew transliterated word like Koheleth. Koheleth is very much somebody who has assembled or gathered or amassed much of what he has learned in life. And in this case, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, commonly we all understand this to be Solomon, the wisest king, one who asked God for wisdom. And in this book called the Ecclesiastes, uh, he actually compiles all the his observations of life. And I guess the word preacher may be better uh, referred to as a kohelet, the Hebrew word, which doesn't really have an English equivalent. It's one who looked at life in general from start to finish, and then pieced them all together and gave us a set of observations from beginning of life to the end of life. And what does it mean? That's the whole book of Ecclesiastes. That's number one. And number two, he speaks of things under the sun. If you look in verse 3, what profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? And the view, or the Hebrew view of life, is very much under the sun. Now, the way that most people look at life, and the Hebrew looks at life very much like the Chinese, actually, very, very, very practical. Uh, what is above would be the skies, or we call the heavens. And then what is where we are standing, it's called land, right? Or earth, right? So whatever Solomon, the Koheleth, is actually explaining is within the realm of his life, from start to finish, from sunrise to sunset. And he looks at all of these from a few perspectives. You must remember, he is a king. He cannot not become a king. And then, we had this Mark Twain story, The Prince and the Pauper, where the prince decides to find a double, and then he goes out and walks around town. That's not what Solomon is doing. Solomon, the wise, sits down and looks at life, looks at his people, looks at it from his perspective of vantage point. Maybe you would call it a helicopter view. And he picks very key lessons that he explains. And this is what he says. Vanity of vanities, says the Koheleth. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And you would see this word repeat itself. I don't know, I didn't count, but many, many times right across the book of Ecclesiastes. And why? This is the theme of the entire book. It is about vanity. Now, what is vanity? Vanity comes from the word hevel, which, if you're careful with hearing the name Hevel, that would be Abel, Cain and Abel. That's the same word. And Abel shows up in Genesis chapter 4, and just for a couple of verses, he kind of disappears from view. That is what the Koheleth is saying. Havel of Havels, right? The vanity of vanities. Havel means transient. It's like a breath, like a vapor. It comes and it goes. It doesn't stay very long. It doesn't have very much usefulness, at least from a perception viewpoint. It's like flowing past a life. And that is what he means. He doesn't mean that life is useless, right? He actually says that life is very, very brief, very transient. And we sing of these songs that life at best is very brief in wake services, old hymns. I sing old hymns, so I remember them. And it's all taken from the book of Ecclesiastes. And so that's what he says. All of life is brief. All of life is transient. All of life moves past without us appreciating whatever usefulness there is. It is just going past and it's drifting and then it goes away. And so it says, what advantage has man from all his toil, his labor? Now, we may think labor as something very bad, right? Very negative. Labor essentially is work. And if you remember in Genesis chapter 4, what is the purpose of Adam? When he was removed or ejected from the Garden of Eden, man has to toil the ground so that he has food. So labor is a God-given occupation, which also tells us this, that if man doesn't work, well, I guess he shouldn't eat, right? Nothing will come out of the ground. And that's what my dad used to say, work, you don't get to eat. And the Chinese concepts and the Hebrew concepts are very similar. So what advantage has a man that we work so hard day and night, in which he works under the sun? Under the sun means things that you can see, things that is visual. And the Hebrew view of life is very visual. Even abstract thoughts like feelings are expressed in very visual ways. So everything under the sun can be seen. Now, the next series of verses is what we read all the time. So very quickly, I want to just spend a little bit of time in chapter 1, and then we will end in chapter 6 for today. We are not going to go through verse by verse because we'll be here until next year. But we need to end sometime, right, within the hour. And so when we read all these common verses from verses 4 all the way to verse let's see, 4 to 9, right? Every set of verses actually says the same thing. And this is a Hebrew way of expressing that life is cyclical. And that is a Hebrew view of life, by the way. For example, the day in Genesis, it's evening and morning, evening and morning. And after morning comes an evening more. So it's cyclical. The week is cyclical. First day to the sixth day, seventh day of rest, and then it comes to the first. The month is cyclical. First month, second month, the new moon will come, then full moon, then very small moon, then no moon, and then the new moon will come. So the month happens. The year happens the same. It goes through a cycle of 12 months, and then it starts again. And interestingly, the Hebrew word for year is Shana. And you should know Rosh Hashanah, Rosh Hashanah would be the beginning of the year, the new year. And Shana really doesn't mean year because the Hebrew doesn't express year. The word Shana means it starts again. And so the year starts again. Now in verse 4 all the way down to verse 9, you see this common theme. One generation passes away, another generation comes. That's a cycle, right? But the earth, the land itself continues. Every time you read the word heavens, try to replace it with skies, what you look up. When you read the word earth, you should replace it with the word land, where you are standing on, so that you can see things in more concrete ways. And then it says the sun also rises. Now, sunrise and sunset is just an observation, right? Sun doesn't move up and down. But the idea here, the word rise in the Hebrew doesn't mean rise. It means that when you look at the horizon, the sun rays starts to pop out and irradiate. And so in English, we call it rise. But in the Hebrew, they call it the sun is radiating. And then when the sun goes down, it just disappears off the horizon. And it quickly goes to when it came up. And so that's a cycle. The wind goes toward the south, turns and goes to the north, and then whirls about continually, and then comes again on its circuit. Now, circuit is predictable. It comes and goes at specific points in time. All the rivers run to the sea, verse 7. Yet the sea is not overflowing. To the place from which the rivers come, they return again. So the rivers, or the wadi, right? If you are familiar with Arabic words and the Hebrew words, wadi is little rivers, and it just flows to the sea because of the terrain. It goes from high to low, and then as it flows to the sea doesn't get filled up. Somehow this water gets back to where the rivers come from in the form of rain by implication, and it rains at the top of the hills and it flows down again. That's a cycle, right? Now, going down to verse 8, things are full of labor. No, we work hard, but we don't know what to say about it. What we see, we are not satisfied with what we see. Our ears is not filled with what we're hearing because there's so much in life that's the hustle and bustle in the modern day terminology. And so verse 9 is his conclusion. That which was is what is. Okay, that's a haya and a yihya. And all this is with relevance to the name of God, Ahya, Asher, Ahya in Exodus chapter 3. These are the play of words that tells us that what was is, and what is will continue to be. So there is nothing new under the sun. And the word new in verse 9 really refers to something like the new moon. Like when you have no moon, the moon comes out again, but actually it's the same moon, right? Every month it comes out. And so that's what it says. It's not saying that we don't do anything new. It says that life is in a cycle. It keeps going. It's got joyful times, it got sad times, it got troublous times, and it keeps going in a cycle. So what can we say? Whatever was in ancient times before, well, it is about things that is to come. Now, is that wisdom? I guess you don't have to pay Anthony Robbins thousands of dollars to tell you this. Solomon, the wise, has already told us in his observation of life, in his grandeur in the palace. He is not saying that, from the time I was born in the palace with a golden spoon to the day I died with the golden spoon, life has been fantastic and great. Solomon was given wisdom by God to show us the reality of life. And although it is from his princely or kingly vantage point, he never forgot the people. And he never once spoke about his life in the palace, because that is irrelevant. That is not what our lives are, right? We are not born with a silver spoon. So that's what he is trying to express. And so he says this, I, the Koheleth, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. Now, this is a very interesting expression. Notice the word was king. That's a past tense. How is it that he was king and that he is king? Didn't he die as a king? And actually, if you remember, when David was at his old age, we always read that David died and then Solomon took over, right? And so when you read from 2 Samuel into 1 Kings, you know what we have observed in detail is that David abdicated his throne to confer the throne to Solomon and to bless Solomon to let him be king and not Absalom. And that in itself gives us a picture that when the king became old, he passed the throne to the next generation. And so now he is now looking back on his entire life, 80 over years, and he says, I set my heart to seek and search. You notice seek and search are ways that the Hebrew expresses two terms that is very much similar to each other by looking for answers, that what wisdom can give to everything that is done under heaven, under the skies. And hereby gives us a glimpse of why Solomon asked God. That he could ask God for anything, remember? But he only asked God for wisdom. Because he wants to know. He is seeking for knowledge. And in knowing, wisdom is the skill to use that experience. And so he was looking for that, and he says, this burdensome task that God has given to the sons of Adam, by which they may be exercised. Now, this is interesting, that they may be busy with life. When God gave Adam the instruction, now that you're outside the Garden of Eden, you can't go out and pluck fruits and everything is great. You've got to work and plant, the sweat will drop through your face. You've got to work hard. And that is what exercise means, being busy with work. And verse 14, I have seen all the things that are done under the sun, and indeed all is transient. All is brief and grasping for the wind. And the word vanity and grasping for the wind, again, I point your attention, appears many times in the book of Ecclesiastes, because that's the theme. Everywhere he looks, he comes back to this conclusion. Remember, vanity, brevity, breath. It's brief and it disappears very quickly. It comes and it goes. That's vanity. It doesn't mean that it is completely useless. It means that its usefulness or the duration of usefulness is short. So life is short in such a manner. And empty in that sense, because much of life is occupied with busyness. And then grasping the wind. The word grasp is not to grasp, unfortunately. So if you had used the English dictionary, we would have completely missed the word. The word grasp and grasping for wind in various instances plays on the word that talks about to be wasted in a sense of feeding. It builds on the word shepherding or pasturing, where you bring sheep to eat grass. And it's a play on that word. Grasping means to eat the wind. And so in Chinese, we have the same idiom, sik feng or eat wind. You are eating, but actually there is nothing tangible. And so it's very much like empty, right? You feel something getting into your mouth, but in the end, nothing is digested, right? And so vanity and grasping for the wind is what I would normally call an A and a B. It's two expressions that is slightly different in its nuance, but actually emphasizing the same thing. That Solomon is saying that I've seen everything that is done. They are all the same. It's brief, it's short. It looks like the usefulness doesn't seem to have very much purpose, and it's empty. It's frustrating. That's what it says. Okay? And so now let me briefly go through a number of sections. The sections give themes. And so Solomon looks at life and gives us, in different sections of the following chapters, very much thematic. Now, I want to say this up front, that the themes come in just three categories. I know many people love these threes, right? I just give you three things you need to remember, and that's the entire book of Ecclesiastes. So I'll give you three things that the book of Ecclesiastes say, which we seldom talk about, but that's what it says, right? It is what it is. And so I leave that to you to appreciate and digest. Life is transient, no doubt, no vanity, right? And so the entire theme is about living the best out of life. So three things. One, enjoy your life. Something which we never talk about. And we will get through this. And I hope that we would spend some time to enjoy life. That's number one. Number two, fear God. Many people say that, well, the book of Ecclesiastes doesn't say very spiritual things. Unfortunately, that's not true. Fear God. And to fear God is really to be afraid of God. So when you enjoy your life, you are balanced by fearing God, knowing what you do need to please God and be good in the eyes of God, and also be fully aware. Why fear? Because he judges. So fearful of his judgment. I remember when I was younger, I have a father who is very conservative, very much old school Chinese man, and he teaches by discipline, right? And heavy discipline. Uh, and I remember one day when I was waiting for my grandmother to pick me up from kindergarten. Kindergarten would be what, 5, 6 years old. She didn't show up on time, and as curious as I was, I decided to walk home and cross the roads. And when I reached home, I was very happy because I made it home in one piece. But then little did I know, everyone was searching for me. And then when my dad came back, he wasn't too thrilled that I walked home without my grandmother at the age of 6. And so out came the cane, and I got the whacking of my life. And from that day onwards, I never walked home, because each time I thought of walking home, the fear of the discipline, right? The fear of God, so the fear of my dad came into play. And so fear God is to always remember that he is there to judge us. But the number three thing, The third thing is this. We will get to it across the chapters, which is indirectly hinted, but clearly depicted next week in chapter 12, which is to keep God's commands. As much as enjoyment in life is important, it is always balanced with who God is in our lives. And that's the wisdom that Solomon is giving us. And so very quickly, I want to give you some of the themes. We won't go through the chapters. Chapter 2. Chapter 2 is about pleasure of life. And the rich have pleasure of life. The rich has lots of plantation, lots of pools to wash themselves, lots of servants all over, lots of herds and so on. So he does address the rich. But what about the rich at the end of the day? And so he says, at the end of the day, in verse 11, just look at what he says. Then I looked at all the works that my hands has done. So I'm a king, so big deal. So there are rich people like me, big deal. All the labor in which I had toiled. Now, as if Solomon rolled up his sleeve and went farming, right? But basically, he identified that he's got all the things that he has amassed. Well, the way that he worked is obviously different from the way we work, but it's still work, right? He's busy with things. And indeed, all was, again, halal and grasping, eating wind, vanity, emptiness. There was nothing advantageous under the sun. What in the world is he saying? We would look at him and say, wow, Solomon, what are you talking about? You have well, not to say one silver spoon or one golden spoon. He has a whole mouthful of cutlery, right? And that's how he was born. He never saw daylight of toiling like David, his father, had, right? Guarding sheep. So what is he saying? There is no advantage for a man who is very rich, a man who is very poor. And that is his theme moving forward. And this is why he concludes. In verse 17, look at what he says. I hated life because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me, for all its vanity and grasping for the wind. Now, first of all, I need to correct a little bit of understanding. The word hate doesn't mean that he hates life. So not quite the English. So whenever we read the English, don't think of Solomon hating his life. It's like, oh shucks, so why do I have so much gold, right? I wish I had no gold. That is really not his meaning. The word hate, it has a broad spectrum of meaning. Obviously, when you hate someone, that's really detesting a person. But when he talks about hating life, he looks at things that just doesn't fit. It doesn't jive, right? In our modern English terms, I hated life because the life doesn't seem to mean much. It doesn't resonate with what I thought it really was. And so whenever I do things, there is pressure, there is stress, and so it's distressing me. Everything I have distresses me. Everything I don't have also distresses me. So he sees life that way. And so he says, all is vanity, grasping for wind. It's like nothing. I hated everything I worked when I worked under the sun because I must leave it for the next guy. And so he sees it as very practical. Now, one thing I want to let you know is that the Hebrew people and Chinese people are very similar in culture. We are all very practical people, very pragmatic. If you can't function and make something out of it, don't talk about it. Unlike the Greeks, one of the reasons the Greeks spend a lot of time thinking is because they spend very little time working. When the Greeks conquered the world with Alexander the Great, everybody worked And the Greeks don't have to because they were the masters of everything. And so people like Socrates and Plato had time to burn. And so they spent the next period of the age thinking, or what we would call philosophizing, thinking through life. But now that we are reading the Old Testament, when you read the Old Testament, like what Solomon is saying, actually it should resonate with us, practicalness of life. You work so hard and then you leave it to the next. So we look at all the rich people in the world. Uh, I'm now reminded of the rich guy in Macau, Stanley Ho, right? Uh, Li Ka-shing, I don't know, whoever else it comes to mind. And then they make all the billions. Then what's going to happen? And so Solomon says, you know what? It's for the one after me. And the guy who comes after me will take over and run it because what have I done? Nothing. He must leave it for the next guy. So verse 24, I will bring your attention to. So his conclusion is this, at least until chapter 2. Nothing is better for a man. Better is the word good, tov. Good or tov is translated in the English in this book with a few words like good, better, pleasure. All of these is the same word. And the idea here is something that is agreeable to man, something that man likes, that things are flowing well. So what is good for man is what man will enjoy doing, right? So what does he say? Say, nothing is good for a man that he should eat and drink. Sounds very Chinese, isn't it? Whenever we get together, it's all about eating and drinking. Whenever we plan a function, it's who brings what to eat and what is there to drink. So eat and drink is a very oriental framework. And so he says, oh, make sure we spend time to eat and drink and enjoy. And please don't be like me, overeat and overdrink and then, spoil a little of life. So get in shape. And then he says, eat and drink and that his nefesh should enjoy good. See, the word good is the same word, better. The good in his labor. You work hard, you should enjoy that labor. This also I saw, and that's the word you would see. I would say many, many times in the book of Ecclesiastes, the word saw, perceive. The idea of seeing is very Hebrew. Like Chinese, very practical. We say in Chinese, very 實際. You can see, and that's good. So Solomon says, I can see that all of these was from the hand of God. Now, think with me. This is his wisdom anyways, right? He says that you amass all these things for what? For the next person who comes after you, that after you die, it's no more. And so he says this is actually given to us from God's hand. I mean, that's how the Hebrew expresses it. The Hebrew says this, anything that you don't know, God must be in it somehow. If I have this, God must have given it to me, whether good or bad, right? That's how the expression is. So it says, for who can eat, verse 25, or who can have enjoyment more than I? Why? I am the king. I'm the pinnacle of the food chain. And yet I am saying this like a commoner. In the book of Deuteronomy, God treats the king much like the commoner because he lives life and lives under the sun much like everybody else. And the instructions given to man is also given to the king. And in fact, God holds the king at a higher standard than the rest of the people because he has access to more. And so he says, I have it all. For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy. Notice, to a man who is good in his sight. See, the word good appears again. Same word, tov. Good in his sight means a person who is doing what is agreeable to God's eyes. That's it. Nothing fantastic about it. So good in his sight is you're doing what God is telling you, but the sinner, he gives the work of doing more, that eventually he will do what is good before God. So what is a sinner? The word sinner merely means the one who is missing the mark. What mark? It is the contrast of good in his sight and the sinner. The sinner is one who missed doing everything God tells him to do. So if he is supposed to cook a dish, so I don't know, I want Peking duck. Solomon says, I want Peking duck from the cook. But the cook came out with a duck, not quite Peking duck, but a duck of some sort. Well, he missed the mark. He is chata. So the English word is translated as sin. He missed the point. So Solomon would say, well, I want Peking duck, not just a duck. And so God says, I want you to do all these things from A to Z, and then you only do A to P. What happened to the rest, Q to Z? You miss the mark. Now, sometimes you do more than A to Z, you do much more. And so the Peking duck becomes an Eskimo duck because it's a totally different dish altogether. So the idea here is, in God's eyes, I would normally use this phrase, God's world, God's rules. Nothing more, nothing less. All he wants us to do is to obey him and to do what he says. And when we do that, you don't have to add to it, but you should not do any less than that. Just like when we approach the king, right? When you go and meet the agong in the palace, there is a protocol. And you realize this. You can't say, I think I'll edit the protocol. I'll change a little bit of this. Maybe I don't wear some of these things. Or I won't say ampun tuanku or whatever tuanku you say. Let me just modify, since we're in the 21st century. Do you think that will fly in the palace? No. The king's palace, the king's rules. You want to go there, you meet his requirements. No more, but no less. So the one who meets is good in his sight. The one who doesn't is called a sinner. And so then it says, at the end of the day, God wants every one of us to be good before God. See, the word good is there. Good in his face. Now notice, the phrase that Solomon keeps using is before God. Why? Because we live before God. Under the sun, God is looking at us, that in the enjoyment of life, we are exposed to God. And hence, eventually, he will come to the point where fear God, watch his judgments, all these make sense, right? Eventually. So good before God is that, just that. You enjoy, but be good before God. But even then, this is brief. And it's not a whole lot of stuff. Obeying God is not a whole lot of stuff either. It's also brief. And the usefulness is the time that we obey. Right? Now, I want to spend a slightly bit of time in chapter 3, because I remember as a young person, we have a song that was built around this. I'm not sure whether you all still sing it, but it's a very long song. To everything, there is a season, and you read it in greeting cards, great encouragement. And why did Solomon suddenly give these sets of ideas all the way to verse 8? 8 verses of stuff. And it is a set of contrasts. You remember when I first began, I said that Solomon was discussing things under heaven, under the skies, under the sun, but on the land, never under the land, right? So it is the time of man, and it is from the beginning to the end. There's always the contrast of start and finish, and that's what he's seeing about life. And he says vanity and grasping for the wind, or eating wind. And so in chapter 3, for 8 verses, he deals with it in some prose. He says to everything, There is a season, and so watch the word season. The word season merely means an appointed time. There is an appointed time. There is a proper time for things to happen. That's all it's saying. It is not saying that there is a predetermined time, right? An appointed time meaning when you want to celebrate a birthday, you don't celebrate a birthday any time of the year. There is an appointed time. So when your birthday, the real date comes, then well, you celebrate it. That's what it means. There is a season. There's an appointed time for and the word time also means season. The word time is a moment. You know the song "A Moment in Time." There is a moment for every purpose under the skies. Now the word purpose doesn't really mean purpose. It means for every desire. The word purpose comes from the word chafetz, where if you read Psalm chapter 1 verse 2, and his desire is for the law of God. That's the same word, desire, purpose, to lean towards something. And so there is a moment. So the word season and time is a same A and B contrast of a nuance to emphasize, the next so many verses I'm going to tell you, it is about there is an appropriate time for many things to happen. That life cannot be haphazard. Life should not be chaotic. Life has a flow. And that is what vanity means, right? Havel means there's a flow. But although it's brief, there is a flow. So it says, a time to give birth. What to be born literally means to give birth. Yeah. You can't give birth all the time, right? You give birth when the time comes. When the water bag bursts, then you know the time is here. So the women knows this very well. And then a time to die, to end the birth, right? So you have a beginning and an end. A time to plant, and the word plant is very much like paddy. When you watch people plant paddy, they grasp a few of the paddy strands with the roots. They poke a hole into the ground where the water and the dirt is, right? And they push it all the way in, and then they cover it with dirt. That's to plant, to strike in and to fasten the plant. And that's what it means to plant, right? And then to pluck, what is planted? Pluck means uproot. So what you have planted, you put the root in, and then you pull it out, so it is unroot. So there's a time for that. There is a time to sow, and there's a time to reap. And then there's a time to kill. Now, in this way, the word kill here is to strike, to kill. To strike, to kill would tell us a time to go for war, and a time to heal and mend and restore and find restoration between people and nations. A time to break down in verse 3. Break down is paratz. Break down doesn't mean break down to cry. Break down means, in the old days, cities have walls. When you breach the wall and break through the wall, and that's the word. There's a time to conquer, to break it down, but there's a time to build up, to rebuild these walls, and to rebuild relationships. A time to weep. The word weep here is to lament. Something like to mourn, but to weep bitterly. And then a time to heal. A time to laugh. Verse 4, a time to laugh. Laugh comes from the same word as Isaac. The word Isaac is Yitzhak. It comes from the word Sahak, which is this word, to laugh. And so Abraham laughed when he heard. Sarah laughed when she heard. And then Sarah really laughed when she gave birth. So it's all about laughing, and then hence Isaac is called laughter, right? He laughs. And so laugh would mean enjoyment, right? Dancing around, literally, right? It gives you that picture. A time to mourn. Weep literally links to the word mourning. Dance is jumping around for joy. And so verse 4 is two sets of parallels. And verse 5, a time to cast stones. Cast stones is to throw at people. Gather stones is to collect. Because there are times to do both, to throw away things and to bring things together to build. A time to embrace, to hug each other, and a time to refrain from embracing. Maybe COVID, but I don't think he had COVID in mind. But the idea here is a time not to embrace, because there are times that you can't hug each other. So you notice, remember, Jacob and Esau. When Esau was angry, nothing to embrace. But when it was a time for reconciliation, Jacob and Esau hugged. A time to gain, to find more things. A time to lose, to perish, to be destroyed. A time to protect things. Keep means to protect. A time to throw away means to discard. Instead of protecting, you throw it away. And there is always a time, spring cleaning perhaps, right? A time to tear, not to tear, right? A tear. This is a verb. To tear apart, and to tear to pieces. And then a time to sew, to put together, to sew it back together. A time to keep silence. And the word silence means to shut up. And that's a good advice, right? A time, there's always a good time to just shut up. And a time to speak. And you see that Solomon would say, speak less, don't be hasty with your words. And then a time to love. And the word love means to give, to cherish. A time to hate, to turn away from things. So instead of giving, you are moving away and you are detesting. A time for fighting, war, and a time for peace. Now he's seeing that from his helicopter view, and he's looking at life and interpreting life and giving his words of wisdom. And then he says this: what profit has the worker from that in which he labors? I have seen the God-given task, that this labor, the busyness, the occupation of man is given by God. They are to be busy. We live to be busy, right? The man will go to work and come back and provide for the family. The woman takes care of the family and glues it together and cooks or whatever. That's the ancient way of doing things. And today, we are all busy with everything, and we come back and we sleep. And so the question is, yes, we are busy, but there is always a time. There is always a season. And he says that God will make these things beautiful, Yahweh, in its time. When the time is right, things will be good. Meaning, what is beautiful? I know we sing the song, he makes all things beautiful in his time. But it really means that in normal days, they are normal. But in the time, in the moment where it is supposed to be, it becomes extraordinary. It becomes normal beauty, becomes very beautiful. Something natural can appear supernatural in its time, in its given time, in its season. And so no one can know what God is doing from start to finish, because God is working and doing things at his right time. That's why we can't tell, right? And so verse 12, I know nothing is good for them. Better is good, comparative good. For them then to rejoice. Be happy. Oh, by the way, that's my name, right? Locke is happy. Be happy and do good in their lives. Now, good, again, good means agreeable in the eyes of the beholder. Do good in the eyes of men. So help them, be good to them, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. Do good in the eyes of God. Be good to God. Live in a way that you love God with all your heart and soul and might. And also that every man should eat, drink, and enjoy the good of his labor. It is the gift of God. Can you see that? Solomon is telling us, go enjoy. Don't be guilty. You work hard, you work right, you work justly, enjoy. Because God has given us life. And to live to the fullest, one should look at every facet of life as what God has given to us. So that's why he says it's a gift of God, is what God has given. But look at verse 15. End of 14 and 15. That God does it that men should fear before him. That which is already been and what is to be has already been. Remember the cycle? It keeps coming around. And what does that mean? It means God requires an account of what has been done. This is about fear of God. Why should men fear God? Is because we need to remember that God will require an account. See, God gives us this free will to do many things, to live life, to be busy, to gain things, and to eat, to drink, to enjoy, be good to before men and be good before God. But all the while behind is number two, fear him because God will judge. Now, the rest of the chapters, you would seem to see a number of things that he says. Injustice exists. Injustice is a big problem, and God considers it an incredible problem in the nation of Israel. See, God looks at Israel as a nation most of the time. And Solomon says, under the sun, there are people who mistreat others. Injustice, Hamas, who will deal unrightly, unjustly, rob people of things, and then they think that they can gain for themselves, and God calls them wicked. God shall judge the righteous and wicked. Verse 17, for there is a right time for every desire of life. Verse 17, that is an incredible verse. Verse 17 tells us, remember the word purpose is chafetz, desire. For everything you do, God will judge. And so be careful. Be careful. Verse 18 onwards gives us this, well, I guess his glimpse of life, Sons of Adam, God is going to test you to see whether you are like animals. Why are you like animals in a way is that all have one breath, verse 19. One died, the other dies. So what has man an advantage over the animals? All is short, right? It's a breath. All go to one place. All become dust. All return to dust. Remember what Genesis chapter 3 is? Who knows the wind of the sons of men, the ruach, and the ruach of men is different. It goes upwards, and that indicates towards God. And we will see that at the end of the book. But the ruach of the animal, the spirit of the animal, goes back to the ground, to the land. And so Solomon says, I perceive nothing is better than a man should rejoice in his own works. That is his heritage. He inherits that. For who can bring him to see what will happen after him? What do you mean happen after him? After he dies, nothing can be said. What is going to happen after this? We don't know. That's what it means here. Now, that is one very interesting observation in the book of Ecclesiastes, as well as in the entire book of the Old Testament. The Old Testament speaks very little, if in fact anything, to do with what happens after this life, what happens after him. They only talk about, yes, he's gone, he's gathered with his fathers, he's gone to Sheol. David says, I can only go to him, he can't come back to me. So it is a one-way ticket, right? It's a one-way thing. But nothing is said, because here it says, who can bring him to see what happens thereafter? Nobody. That's the answer. It's rhetorical. And so the idea here is make the best out of this life. Now, it talks about the value of friends, value of popularity. And then in chapter 5, tells them to do right when they go to the house of God. You know what's the house of God, right? That's the temple. Why? Because even though you enjoy life, you cannot forget about God. So when you do things at the temple, you walk correctly, right? Don't give weird and silly offerings. Don't be quick with your mouth, right? And so these are all very practical things. When you make a promise to God, make sure you do it. Why? Now, this is one thing that many of us may not appreciate. When you make a promise to God, you're making it to Almighty God. You're not making it just to man and say, oh, I can just kid around and I was just joking, right? And although people say, cross my heart, hope to die, that's not what verse 4 is saying. When you deal with God, it's a serious matter. God has no intent of us joking around. So you notice, God is not this mamak stall God that we can actually hug around and kid around, and you can't say, God, I didn't mean it. There's none of those, right? None of those. So let's quickly now come to the last part. Our last part is chapter 6. It says, there is an evil under the sun in chapter 6. And it's common among men. And now he goes into a bigger framework. I've said many things, Solomon says, and these are interesting observations. But he says, some things which cuts across all mankind. See, to a man, God has given big things, right? Wealth, riches, treasures, so that he lacks nothing. But yet he doesn't give him the power to eat of it. And somebody comes and consumes it. And so it's vanity. It's a disagreeable oppression. No, the word evil here is not moral. So don't always look at the word evil as moral, immoral. It's amoral, but it's evil. And the word is ra. And ra literally means the opposite of good. Good is agreeable in the eyes of the beholder. So evil would be disagreeable in the eyes of the beholder. So why is this evil? Because to the rich man, that's not what he wants. Why would he work so hard and all these God-given riches and somebody gets to enjoy it? That to him is unfair, right? And so he does express all of these things. He says, you know what? You do all these things, you're still not satisfied. So how do we walk before God? Verse 9, better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. This is also vanity, grasping for the wind, eating wind. And so the idea here is, so verse 12 is what I want to end with. Sorry, not end with, but yeah, that's what we are to end with. Sorry. Verse 12. So let us take a summary for these first 6 verses. 11 says, since there are many things that increase vanity, increase brevity of life, like things that cuts our life short. So how is man better? Better than what? Better than an animal. How is man? Can you imagine? Why would we even ask this kind of question? It is not just one man comparing with another. What's the difference? The rich will get different problems. Now, one of the things that we seldom think about is the rich guy seems to have everything good in life. Actually, it's not true. It's not true. The rich has his own problems, which you don't want. And the poor has his own problems, which the rich doesn't want. And each have their own problems. And there's no one that has no problems. That's what Solomon is saying. So how is man better when it's all these things? Verse 12, for who knows what is good, agreeable for in the eyes of man in his life? All the days of his vain life, he lives and he passes life like a shadow. You know, shadow? You know the sundial. The sundial is an object that casts a shadow by the sunlight. And it moves, right? As the sun moves, the shadow moves. It gives us this connotation that life is just like it's a passing shadow. And then you ask, hey, who was there? That's what a shadow is. Who can tell a man what will happen after him under the sun? Now let's unpack this for our final verse. Can tell a man. A man would be like you and I. It's a rhetorical question, but in its application, you and I. You know, if life is just fleeting, it just comes by, then what will come after this? And the word after is the word behind. I think the idea here that we need to appreciate is the concept of the Hebrew directions. Okay, so let me just give us a brief understanding. The word after and before have immense implications. Now, it doesn't have much in the English, but it has immense implication in the Hebrew. So let me end with this. In the Hebrew mind, what is in front of a person is what he can see. What he can see is what has happened. Okay? That life is seen under the sun. I can see it. It's already happened. It's before me. What is after means what is behind, that comes behind me. Now, I can't tell what is behind me. So the Hebrew looks at what comes after me has not yet happened. And I can't tell. And even under the sun, that one happens, and what is the next thing that's going to happen behind me? I don't know. And that's what Solomon is saying in this question. Who can tell a man what will happen after him under the sun? Now, always remember, under the sun. We're not talking about afterlife here. We're talking about life. As life is being lived, what can you say about what's going to come next? That's the question, right? Doesn't give an answer here. He gives this answer in the next 6 chapters. And that's why it's appropriate to draw a line here for next week so that we can come and draw to a final close. The wisdom of Solomon is before us to discuss with us the meaning of life. Or the title here, the meaninglessness of life. Or it appears to be meaningless. Why? Because when we are all so busy, I'm not sure whether you have had this experience. When we get so busy, you wake up early in the morning, you go to work, you come back very late at night, you get very tired, you sleep, and you wake up early next day, you continue doing this. And then one day you wake up and says, what is all this for? And then the book of Ecclesiastes will come in very, very handy. What's going to happen after today? Who can tell me? Which is why Solomon has been saying, you know what? After all the busyness, God wants us to work. God also wants us to enjoy. It is a gift of God. God gave us a life, not just to work. The work is to remind us that we are not in Eden. Something had happened. But it is also remind us that there is meaning to life, that work is not the end of it. Work is the means of it. And as such, I hope that it begins to solidify the thoughts of Solomon in our minds as to what he's saying in the book of Ecclesiastes. The Koheleth is the one who is amassing all his wealth of life And like an old man, he comes back, but he doesn't, he's not like repeating his younger days. He is giving us principles of life. Remember, it's all about under the sun. He knows he can't talk about what is after the life. He can't talk about what is before the life, but he can talk about what he has seen in life under the sun. What are the principles? The rich have the problem, the poor have the problem. Everybody has a problem. The foolish have a problem. When you do things, enjoy your life. One, remember. Number two, fear God, for he will judge. That's the two things that he has talked about. The third we will see next week. So who can tell what will happen? And the answer is not an event. The answer is not a particular thing. The answer is found in the next 6 chapters of the book of Ecclesiastes. Our life certainly is brief, but we should live it well and live it good before God, to do what is pleasing to him, to fear him, to remember that he is ultimately our judge. And that is what he expects of us. And hence, I trust that we have this first part of Ecclesiastes, and that we can continue to wrap it up next week to find out point number 3 and how he wraps things up. Right? May God bless his words.